Still, the trust document rustled as my son-in-law flipped pages too fast, his smile freezing when the numbers never came. As I folded my hands instead of stopping him, I kept my face calm, letting the paper speak for itself. While the thin pages whispered under his fingers, I felt the room tighten with every clause he'd ignored. The same rustle followed my thoughts as I realized he hadn't married my daughter for love, but for access. That's when it became clear. A husband's entitlement was the very trigger written into the trust. Still, the document rustled as I decided to say nothing, because justice had already signed him out. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The grand hall was bathed in golden light, reflecting off the polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers that seemed to float above the gathering. Edward stood quietly at the back of the room, watching the guests murmur in awe at the extravagance of the ceremony. Everything had been planned to perfection, from the meticulously arranged flowers to the lavish 5-tier cake, towering over the crowd like a sweet promise. It was the kind of day that whispered of old money, the kind Edward had spent a lifetime building, wealth that had shaped his family's world, but had never been spoken of directly. The soft murmur of conversation, punctuated by the occasional clink of champagne flutes, filled the air as Claire walked down the aisle. She was radiant, the kind of beauty that seemed effortless, yet the weight of the day hung on her, just slightly. Her father's gaze softened, a rare crack in his otherwise composed demeanor. He had seen her grow from a little girl into a woman, someone who had always believed in love without hesitation. Today, as she reached Ryan's side, she was glowing, trusting, eager, and entirely unaware of the forces that had already started to stir beneath the surface of her perfect world. Ryan stood at the altar, the picture of charm. His smile was wide but practiced. He made eye contact with every guest, his posture perfect, his words carefully measured. His eyes flicked over the crowd with the practiced ease of someone used to being admired. But there was something just a touch too polished about it. His attention, though outwardly devoted to Claire, had already begun to stray. He noticed the quiet approval in the eyes of the guests, the subtle nods, the unspoken acknowledgement of the wealth they all admired. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he filed it away, a mental note in his ever-calculating mind. This was a game to him, after all, a game he intended to win. Edward's thoughts, however, remained impassive. He congratulated them both with a calm, measured tone. His words were simple. "I hope you find joy, Claire. Ryan, take good care of her." There was no fanfare in his voice, no real warmth to the exchange, only a watchful distance. To Claire, it was the same unwavering support he had always given, but to Ryan, it was a carefully calculated acknowledgement of the life they were about to step into. No mention was made of the wealth that underpinned this day. Not a word about the inheritance, the trust, or the assets. They were all invisible, sealed away in a world of legal jargon and protective clauses. But Ryan, sharp, ambitious, and always looking for leverage, noticed the silence. He felt it more than he saw it, the subtle restraint in Edward's words, in the way Claire's father never let himself be too involved in the celebration. To him, it wasn't just about love, it was about control. And the moment he stepped into this family, he had already started thinking about how to secure his future. The ceremony moved on as they always do. Vows were exchanged, promises made. But in the space between each word, each smile, Edward stood quietly observing, his mind already shifting into the next phase. Because today wasn't just about a wedding. Today was the beginning of something far more complex. And for Ryan Mercer, the real test hadn't even begun yet. As the ceremony wrapped up and the applause filled the air, Edward's thoughts were already on the next step. He hadn't said much, but he had already said enough. The tension, thick and subtle, lingered in the air, unspoken, but felt by all. And somewhere, as the crowd began to filter into the reception, Ryan realized that Edward's calmness was more than just stoic reserve. It was strategy. And that made him wonder just what he had walked into. The champagne flowed, the music played on. But in Edward's mind, the game had already begun. The wedding day had come to a close. Guests trickled out, leaving behind an empty house, filled only with the faint echoes of laughter and music. The silence felt louder than the celebrations. Claire stood by the window of her childhood home, staring out at the now darkened yard. Her wedding day had been flawless, the kind of fairy tale every girl dreams of. But as she absent-mindedly adjusted the hem of her dress, a quiet doubt crept into her mind, as if the perfect day had been too perfect, like something was missing, though she couldn't quite place what. Edward observed her from the doorway, standing motionless with his hands loosely at his sides. His eyes, calm but sharp, studied his daughter with an intensity that hadn't dulled over the years. There was something in her gaze that reminded him of how she used to be, innocent, full of hope. But that innocence had started to fade. Today she was no longer just his little girl. She was someone else's wife. His daughter's future was no longer solely in his hands, and the thought unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But it wasn't just that. It was the man she had chosen to marry. Edward's eyes flicked briefly to the other room, where Ryan, the new son-in-law, had already begun to put his mark on the house. He could see the slight unease on Claire's face. She wasn't entirely unaware, but how could she know? How could she understand the delicate web of control that had been woven around her since the day she was born? Edward stepped forward, breaking the stillness between them. "Claire," he said, his voice low but firm, "you've made a big decision today." She turned to face him, her eyes wide with the same trusting expression he'd seen since she was young. "I know, Dad. It feels right. Ryan's everything I've always wanted." Her smile was bright, but there was a slight tremor behind it, one he didn't miss. Edward's heart tightened, but he masked it. "I'm sure he is," he replied, his tone measured. "But remember, Claire, life doesn't always work out how you expect. Take things slow. Don't rush it." She tilted her head, a slight crease forming between her brows. "What do you mean, Dad? Everything's perfect. We'll figure things out." Edward's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He had to fight the urge to tell her the truth, to warn her that the path she was walking wasn't as clear as it appeared. Instead, he spoke carefully, almost distantly. "Trust in yourself. Don't let the world around you move faster than you're ready for. You'll see, everything comes in time. But don't let anyone rush you." Claire smiled, but it was hesitant now, the weight of his words starting to settle in. She reached out, hugging him briefly before stepping away, her demeanor still optimistic, yet slightly guarded. "Thanks, Dad. I know you just want what's best for me." Edward nodded, his hand lingering in the space she'd occupied a moment ago. She left him standing alone, his thoughts heavy with things unsaid. His advice had been indirect, more a quiet reminder than anything else, but he knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. Ryan entered, breaking his reverie. He moved with his usual confidence, but something had shifted since the ceremony. His smile was a little too tight, his eyes too calculating. The charm he had worn so effortlessly all day was starting to slip. "So what's next, Edward?" Ryan asked, his voice a bit too smooth. "We've got to start our future strong, right? Maybe talk about some investments. I've got a few ideas I'd like to run by you." Edward watched him, unwavering. "Patience is important, Ryan. Everything in time." Ryan's smile faltered for a moment, and in the silence that followed, the tension between them thickened. Ryan was accustomed to immediate results, to people seeing him as a man of ambition and drive. But Edward's calm refusal, his deliberate deflection, made something inside Ryan shift, ever so slightly. It wasn't outright hostility, but it was something colder, something that didn't quite fit the narrative Ryan had crafted for himself. Ryan's smile tightened, but he said nothing. There was an unspoken challenge in the room now, a silent war of wills that neither man was willing to acknowledge fully, yet both felt. Edward's gaze never wavered as he offered his brief, measured response. And when he turned to leave, Ryan's eyes followed him, a flicker of frustration growing behind the surface of his charm. The silence in the room stretched longer than it should have. Something was changing, but neither of them could yet see it clearly. Edward's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he walked away, and Ryan stood there for a long moment, the weight of his own thoughts settling heavily on his chest. The quiet had taken on a new meaning, and neither of them knew what would come next. The days after the wedding had a quiet weight to them. The laughter from the reception had faded, the guests had gone home, and now Claire and Ryan were left alone in the house, newlyweds, but already shifting into their next phase of life. Ryan, more focused than ever, had been quietly planning what he saw as the future, his future. Claire was sitting at the kitchen table sipping coffee when Ryan slid into the seat across from her, a stack of brochures and papers in front of him. He was already in full future mode, something she noticed more and more these days. She smiled weakly, unsure what to expect. "So," Ryan began, his voice casual but with an edge of urgency, "I've been thinking about investments, property upgrades, the whole deal. We need to start setting things up, you know?" Claire raised an eyebrow, her fingers lightly tapping her mug. "We've only just gotten back from the wedding. Don't you think we can take things slow?" Ryan didn't seem to hear her. He leaned forward, eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Listen, we can't afford to waste time. It's all about laying the groundwork now. And once your inheritance comes in, that'll help take things to the next level." Claire froze, a frown tugging at her brow. "Inheritance?" she repeated, unsure of what Ryan meant. "I don't even know the details of it. My dad's never really discussed it with me." Ryan smiled, brushing her hesitation aside. "Come on, Claire. We both know how much your father's worth. It's not a secret. And when that inheritance comes through, it'll be a game changer for us. We'll be able to build the life we want." Claire laughed nervously, trying to shake off the sudden tension. "I mean, sure, but I don't know when or how that will happen. My dad's always been secretive about it." Ryan's expression tightened for a moment, but then he quickly recovered. "Exactly. That's why we need to get ahead of it. Plan ahead. You've got a lot more coming your way than you realize. We need a timeline." Claire's stomach turned slightly. She had never thought much about her father's wealth, nor the inheritance Ryan seemed so eager to bring up. Her father had always been protective of her, not just in terms of his wealth, but in general. The idea of Ryan pushing for details so casually unsettled her. "I don't know, Ryan. My dad's always been private about that kind of thing. I don't think it's something we can rush," she said, her voice softer now, more uncertain. Ryan leaned back, his eyes scanning the room. but the intensity in them didn't fade. "We don't need to rush," he said, his voice smooth but with an underlying tension. "But we should start thinking about what comes next, Claire. We don't want to be caught off guard when it does happen." Before Claire could respond, Edward walked into the kitchen. He paused when he saw the quiet exchange, his gaze flicking between his daughter and Ryan. There was something about the way Ryan was speaking that made him feel uneasy, but he said nothing, at least not right away. Edward quietly poured himself a cup of coffee, the silence thickening. After a moment, he turned to face them both. "Ryan, let me remind you that patience is key. We don't need to act on assumptions, not when we don't know everything yet." Ryan's smile tightened, but he kept his composure. "Of course, Edward. I was just thinking ahead." Edward's gaze didn't waver. "Patience, Ryan. It's not about jumping ahead of things. It's about being prepared when the time comes. That's how you build something that lasts." Ryan didn't argue, but Claire could feel the change in the air. She wasn't sure what had shifted, but the conversation had taken on a different weight. Edward left the room without another word, but Claire felt her father's presence linger. She glanced at Ryan, who was suddenly much quieter. His earlier enthusiasm dimmed. The quiet between them was heavier now, filled with unspoken thoughts, and Claire's unease only grew. What had started as a hopeful conversation about the future now felt like a slow, deliberate game of chess, and she wasn't sure she understood all the moves. Ryan's smile faltered slightly as he reached for his papers again, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. In the space between the three of them, there was more than just silence. It was tension. And for the first time, Claire wondered if she could truly trust the man sitting across from her. Edward's words echoed in her mind. Patience is key. But as the minutes stretched on, Claire realized that there was something else at play here, a game she hadn't yet fully seen, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The day after the wedding was a blur of excitement and motion. Claire and Ryan were ready to leave for their honeymoon, a tropical escape that had been planned meticulously. The car was packed, and the sound of luggage being loaded filled the otherwise quiet house. Claire smiled as she stood at the door, feeling the weight of the day lift as the promise of a peaceful getaway loomed. Ryan, always aware of his image, was already posting about their departure. His phone clicked non-stop as he shared images of Claire in the airport lounge, bathed in sunlight, a picture of happiness and ease. The captions were perfect. First day of forever. Hatch a honeymoon. Blessed. He posted one after another, each image more curated than the last, portraying their new life as flawless. Claire, on the other hand, was lost in the joy of the moment, her heart light. She laughed at Ryan's insistence on taking just one more shot, unaware of the deeper game being played. She was genuinely happy, caught up in the beauty of their first days as husband and wife. She was so sure of the future, the life ahead, that she couldn't see the subtle, deliberate framing of their public image. It was all too perfect. At home, Edward watched quietly, sitting alone in his study. The house felt emptier now, the quiet after the wedding louder than any celebration could have been. His eyes never left the screen as he monitored their departure. His thoughts were focused on Claire, but his mind was sharp, calculating, always watching. He knew how fragile things were, how easily Ryan's charm could mask his true intentions. The game had already begun, even if Claire didn't know it yet. Victor, the family attorney, had called earlier that morning, confirming the status of the legal protections Edward had set up. "Everything is locked in," Victor assured him. "No transfers have been made. All clauses are in place." Edward had expected as much, but it did little to ease the tension gnawing at him. He knew Ryan would push, would find ways to get what he wanted. The honeymoon was only the beginning. Claire, oblivious to the growing web of control, continued to post her photos with Ryan. She shared a picture of herself by the pool, sun shining down on her, the blue of the ocean stretching out behind her. Ryan, ever the perfectionist, adjusted the angle, making sure everything looked just right. His smile was wide, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Claire didn't notice. She was too lost in the warmth of the moment, the glow of her new life. The image she shared, the life she thought she was stepping into, was perfect. Her caption read, "Living the Dream." Honeymoon vibes. Edward sat back, taking in the digital images from afar. He had seen this before, the way Ryan curated their lives for the world. He'd seen the signs long ago, the subtle shifts in Ryan's behavior, the way he was always measuring and calculating. Edward had spent years building the kind of life Claire was inheriting. It wasn't just about money. It was about control, about ensuring that what mattered most was protected. Ryan's post continued. Another beach shot, another posed picture of Claire laughing, looking like she had everything she'd ever wanted. Edward's gaze remained steady on the screen, unblinking as the day stretched on. Nothing had changed yet. Nothing had been transferred. But he knew that Ryan's true test was coming soon. It was a matter of time. Edward waited, watching as the hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. The pieces were in place, and soon enough, the tension would reach its peak. But for now, it was only the calm before the storm. The game had only just begun, and Edward was ready. Edward sat alone in his study, the glow of the desk lamp casting a soft, steady light over the papers before him. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the surface of the desk as his mind raced, sifting through everything that had led to this point. The house was quiet, too quiet, but he wasn't bothered by it. Silence was his ally. The trust documents lay before him, familiar and cold. He'd gone over them countless times, but tonight they felt more important than ever. Ryan, the man Claire had married, was still on his honeymoon, oblivious to the truth that Edward had carefully set in place. The wedding had gone off without a hitch, just as planned, but Edward knew that the real test had only just begun. There was a subtle power in waiting, in knowing that every move had already been made, and that all that remained was to watch as Ryan's facade began to crack. Edward's gaze moved over the papers once again. The trust, Claire's inheritance, secured by more than just legalese. It was protected by years of careful planning. He had arranged it all when Claire was still a child, never knowing the weight of what it meant. He had known then that life could change in an instant, and that there were people who would come into Claire's life and see her as a way to unlock wealth that wasn't theirs. Ryan had been one of those people. As Edward read the clauses again, the same realization swept over him. Ryan had no access to Claire's inheritance, now or ever. Not unless he fulfilled one very specific condition, one that could never be guessed or manipulated. Edward had set it up that way years ago, anticipating the kind of man Ryan would become. He'd suspected from the beginning that Ryan would see Claire's wealth as his own, that he'd assume marriage would give him automatic access. But that wasn't the case, not by a long shot. The inheritance wasn't some automatic transfer that Ryan could expect after signing a marriage certificate. It was based on conditions tied to Claire's life and her choices. Ryan could have been married to Claire for 50 years, and it wouldn't matter. The funds would remain out of reach. It was a test, not of love or loyalty, but of patience and integrity. A test that Edward doubted Ryan would pass. Edward leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the pages once more. He could feel the weight of the years of planning bearing down on him. He had been precise, deliberate. The moment Claire was born, he had known this day would come. A day when someone would try to take what wasn't theirs. Someone who would manipulate their way into her life for the wrong reasons. Ryan thought that marriage was the key to everything, that once Claire said, "I do," the door would swing open for him. But Edward had been prepared for that. He had set the rules long before Ryan had even met Claire. And as he read through the fine print again, Edward's mind was sharp with certainty. Ryan wouldn't pass the test. The clause was clear. It wasn't about time. It wasn't about love. It was about something else, something Ryan couldn't fake. Claire's inheritance was a promise, a legacy, and no matter how much Ryan pushed or manipulated, he couldn't force his way into it. Only one condition could unlock the funds, and Edward doubted Ryan would ever meet it. He had seen the signs, the way Ryan moved through life with a sense of entitlement, the signs of a man who believed things should be given to him, not earned. Edward allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He had watched his daughter grow, watched her marry a man who, to the outside world, seemed perfect for her. But Edward knew better. He knew that the perfect image Ryan portrayed was just a mask. Beneath it, there was something darker, a desire to control, to take, and that was something Edward could never allow. His fingers brushed the edge of the papers once again, and he allowed the calm certainty to settle in. Everything was secure. Everything was in place. Edward had prepared for this moment long before Claire even knew it was coming. He had set the trap, and now all he had to do was wait. Ryan had no idea what he was walking into. He thought he was in control, but he wasn't. The game had already been set, and as Claire's new life began, she was walking down a path that, for all her dreams of happiness, was already set in motion. Edward sat back in his chair, the quiet stillness of the room pressing in on him. The next move was Ryan's, and he had no idea what was coming. For now, Edward waited. But he knew the truth. Ryan would never have access to the wealth he thought he was entitled to. And soon Claire would learn that the life she thought she was entering had already been decided. The game was only beginning, and Edward was ready. The honeymoon, once a dream come true, had started to feel like something else entirely. The island paradise, with its sparkling beaches and perfect sunsets, now seemed to Claire like a backdrop to a drama she hadn't expected. She had tried to push the nagging discomfort away, but Ryan's insistence on certain things was slowly unraveling the blissful image of their new life together. It began subtly, with Ryan suggesting they open joint accounts. It sounded innocent at first, logical even. They were married now after all, but there was something about his tone, the way he phrased it, that unsettled Claire. One morning, while they sat on the balcony overlooking the ocean, he casually brought it up. "Don't you think it's time to combine everything?" Ryan said, his smile wide and easy, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "I mean, we're married now. It's only natural we're completely transparent with each other, right?" Claire took a sip of her coffee, staring out at the waves, feeling a slight unease. It was a simple request, yet something in the way Ryan framed it felt off. She had never considered merging everything so soon. Her father had always kept things separate, and that made her feel a little more secure. I don't know, Ryan, she replied hesitantly. I've never really thought about that. I guess I'm not used to it. She tried to laugh it off, but her voice was tinged with uncertainty. Ryan's smile faded for a brief moment, and Claire saw something flicker in his eyes, something impatient, almost demanding. Come on, Claire, we need to trust each other completely. We're building a future here. Don't you want to do this the right way? Claire swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She wasn't ready to dive into financial transparency, especially with someone she had only just married. But Ryan, sensing her hesitation, pressed further. It's just about trust, Claire, he said, his voice smooth. We can't build anything strong if we're hiding things from each other. Claire nodded slowly, but the more she thought about it, the less comfortable she became. There was an urgency to Ryan's words, an intensity she hadn't anticipated. And it wasn't just about the joint accounts. It was everything. As the days passed, Ryan's spending grew increasingly extravagant. What had started as casual trips to upscale shops soon turned into impulsive purchases. Designer bags, watches, and jewelry. Claire began to feel like she was watching a version of Ryan she hadn't seen before, one that seemed fixated on money and status. It didn't feel like a honeymoon anymore. It felt like a transaction. One evening, after another lavish dinner, Ryan started showing her more property listings, luxury villas, apartments in the city. We should buy a place like this, he said, tapping on the screen of his phone. Imagine having a second home here. We could come back every year. Claire's stomach tightened. It wasn't just the expense. It was the speed with which Ryan was pushing everything forward. Every conversation seemed to revolve around what they could buy, what they could own. It felt more like a business deal than the start of a marriage. Ryan, don't you think it's a little soon for all this? Claire asked, her voice quiet. We've only just started. We don't even know what our lives will look like once we get back home. Ryan's face hardened for a second, and then his smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. You don't get it, do you? We need to secure our future now, Claire. What's the point of waiting? The force of his words caught her off guard. She felt the sharp edge of something unsaid in his voice. It was no longer about sharing a life. It was about control. And Claire wasn't sure she was ready for that. The honeymoon atmosphere was starting to cool, replaced by a growing tension that Claire couldn't shake. She tried to laugh it off, but she couldn't ignore the pressure building inside her. That night, as Claire lay in bed, her mind raced. Ryan slept soundly beside her, but she couldn't quiet the unease that had settled in her chest. Every day felt like it was slipping away from her, as though she was losing control of something she hadn't even realized was slipping through her fingers. The honeymoon was supposed to be a time of joy, but for the first time, Claire wasn't sure who she was married to anymore. The cracks were showing, but she didn't know how to fix them, or if she even could. The tension between them was palpable, and as she turned over to face him, she realized that things had already changed. She just wasn't sure how deep the changes went. Edward sat alone in his study, the dim light from his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The house was quiet, the evening calm, but he could feel the weight of the moment. The phone on his desk vibrated, cutting through the stillness. He glanced at the screen. Ryan Mercer. It had been a matter of time before this call came. Edward took a slow breath and picked up the receiver. Edward. Ryan's voice crackled through, forced, but trying to sound casual. I need to talk to you. Edward didn't respond immediately, allowing the silence to stretch, letting Ryan fill it. He could already hear the tension in Ryan's voice. It was time. I'm in a bit of a situation, Ryan continued, as if this was a conversation between equals. We're trying to settle down and I've got some opportunities to secure our future. But I need some capital to make it happen. Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He'd seen this before. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. Go on, Edward said, his tone even. Ryan hesitated, then pushed forward, trying to frame his demand. It's my responsibility as her husband, Edward. You understand that, right? I'm just trying to make sure Claire and I have the security we need. I think you can see that this is just part of what I need to do for her. Edward's fingers tightened on the edge of his desk. The audacity of Ryan's words, his calm assertion of entitlement, set something cold in motion inside him. It wasn't just a request. It was a test. Ryan didn't ask for a favor. He was making a demand. I'm not giving you money, Ryan, Edward replied, his voice calm, unwavering. Not now, not ever. There was a pause. The silence seemed to stretch, almost unbearable. Ryan, on the other end, sputtered for a moment, caught off guard by the refusal. Wait, what do you mean, not ever? This is for Claire's future. Our future, Ryan said, his voice edging into frustration now. The politeness slipping away. You really think I can just figure this out alone? Don't you want what's best for her? Edward's gaze remained steady. He had seen Ryan's type before. Charming, ambitious, driven by something far less pure than love. The control he sought was clear, and Edward wasn't about to let him pull it off so easily. Claire's future isn't tied to your plans, Edward said softly, but firmly. What's best for her is what she chooses, not what you think she's entitled to. Ryan's tone shifted again, this time to something more biting. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about entitlement, Edward. This is about responsibility. I'm trying to build something for her. You can't expect me to just wait around for whatever crumbs you throw my way. The sharpness of Ryan's words hit harder than Edward anticipated. He remained composed, but his mind was already racing. He could hear Ryan's frustration, but there was a deeper tone, one that bordered on something darker. Ryan wasn't simply trying to provide. He was trying to claim. I'm not playing your game, Ryan, Edward replied, his voice colder now. I've seen men like you before. You'll need to find another way. Ryan let out a strained laugh, but it was hollow. You think I'm the one playing games? Fine. If you're not going to help, I'll handle it myself. But don't think I'll forget this. Edward didn't respond. He just set the phone down gently, letting the silence reclaim the room. His fingers lingered on the receiver, but his mind was already elsewhere, processing the words, the threats, and the deeper truth they revealed. Ryan had shown his hand. The tension between them was palpable, but Edward wasn't concerned. Ryan had underestimated him, just as he had underestimated everything else. This wasn't about a loan or a favor. It was about power, and Edward wasn't about to hand over control. He sat still for a moment, letting the weight of the call sink in. Ryan thought this was a simple transaction. Edward knew better, and the game had just begun. The villa felt quieter than it should have, the kind of silence that sat heavy in the air. Claire hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something had changed between her and Ryan. She tried to ignore it, to let the carefree honeymoon atmosphere return. But every time she looked at him, there was an unsettling shift in his gaze, something hidden just beneath the surface. It wasn't until a few days later, as they sat by the pool, that Ryan's words broke through the tension. He was lounging beside her, his fingers tracing circles on her wrist, but there was something off about the way he spoke. "You know, Claire," he began, his voice soft but insistent, "I don't think your dad trusts you." Claire blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. Ryan's expression softened, as if he were sharing a secret. "He's been keeping you in the dark, hasn't he? About everything. I mean, he doesn't let you make your own decisions, doesn't really trust you to handle things on your own." Claire's heart stuttered, the words hitting her with an unfamiliar sting. She opened her mouth to argue, but Ryan pressed on, his voice lowering as if he were guiding her toward an uncomfortable truth. "He's been controlling, Claire. You don't see it because you're so close to him, but don't you feel it? The way he holds everything back, like he's protecting you from something you don't need protection from." Ryan's eyes bored into hers, urging her to understand. Claire's stomach churned, a knot forming deep inside her. Her father had always been protective, but she'd never seen it as mistrust. Had she been blind to it all this time? She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know," she murmured. "I've never thought of it that way." Ryan's tone softened, as if he were consoling her. "You deserve better, Claire. You deserve to be in control of your own life, to not feel like you're living in his shadow. We could build something together, something real, but only if you trust yourself." Claire felt torn, unsure of where her loyalty should lie. She didn't want to believe Ryan, but his words planted a seed of doubt, one she couldn't shake. She had always trusted her father. He'd been her protector, her constant. But now she wasn't so sure. Later that day, as Claire called her father, she noticed a shift in her tone. She was distant, cautious, as if a wall had been built between them, even if she didn't fully understand why. Edward's voice, always so steady, seemed to reflect her uncertainty, and Claire felt the awkwardness of it in the silence that followed. On the other end of the line, Edward noticed the change immediately. Her words were shorter, colder, and the familiar warmth he'd always felt during their conversations was gone. Something was off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew something had shifted. Helen, ever observant, noticed it too. She had been quietly tracking the subtle changes in Claire's behavior and the growing tension in the air. Claire's calls to Edward were now brief and distant, and the concern in her father's voice hadn't gone unnoticed by Helen. Edward's mind began to sharpen. He knew this wasn't just about a disagreement over money or the future. It was something deeper. Ryan had found his way in, planted seeds of doubt, and now Claire was drifting. He wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. He had prepared for this moment, even if Claire hadn't yet realized it. The pressure was turning inward, and Edward was ready to act. The question now was how much longer Claire would stay lost in Ryan's web before she realized where her true loyalty lay. And Edward, with every passing moment, grew more determined to protect her, no matter the cost. The early return from their honeymoon had an unexpected weight to it. The villa that had once felt like a dream now seemed smaller, the air thicker with an unspoken tension. Claire had tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that the honeymoon had just ended too soon. But something about Ryan's energy had changed. His charm, once effortless, now felt forced. The smiles he flashed were polite, but hollow, as though he were playing a role, one that had suddenly become much harder to perform. Ryan moved through the house with purpose, his gaze flicking over the familiar surroundings. Yet there was an unsettling calculation behind his eyes. "Home, sweet home," he said, the words too casual, as if he were trying to convince both Claire and himself that everything was fine. But Claire could sense the strain beneath his voice. She tried to shake off the discomfort, but it lingered, growing in the silence between them. Ryan turned to her as she stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "This place is great, but we need to start thinking about the future, right?" He paused, watching her carefully. "I was thinking, Claire, we can't keep waiting around forever. I mean, your dad's trust. Don't you think it's time we had a real conversation about that?" Claire's stomach tightened at the mention of the trust. She hadn't expected Ryan to bring it up so soon, but his urgency was unmistakable. It was almost like he had been waiting for the right moment to make his move. She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward her father's study, then back at Ryan. "What about it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. But there was an edge to it. The excitement from their honeymoon felt far away now, replaced by this sudden pressure. Ryan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if speaking in confidence. "I've been patient, Claire, but we're married now. We need to start building our future. The trust. We need to figure out where we stand. Your dad hasn't exactly been forthcoming, has he? Don't you think it's time for clarity?" Claire felt a flicker of unease, but she didn't want to show it. She trusted her father, had always trusted him. "Dad's just being careful. You know how he is," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. Ryan's smile faltered for a moment before quickly returning, but it was different now. There was a sharpness to it, a quiet impatience she hadn't seen before. "Sure, he's careful, but there's being careful, and then there's being unreasonable. We've been married for weeks, Claire. I think it's time we talk about the next step, don't you?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Edward appeared at the door, his presence immediate and commanding. He stood there, observing Ryan with a quiet intensity, his eyes scanning the younger man with an unreadable expression. "Is something wrong?" Edward's voice was calm, but the slight edge of steel beneath it was unmistakable. He had been waiting for this moment, knew it would come, and now it had arrived. Ryan, never one to back down, straightened up and flashed a forced smile. "Just thinking about the future, Edward, about the trust. Claire and I think it's time we had a real conversation about it." Edward didn't flinch. "You think it's time?" His voice remained calm, but the weight of the words carried authority. "I'm afraid it's not up to you to decide that." Ryan's smile tightened, and for a moment the charm slipped, revealing a brief flash of frustration. "I'm not asking for much, just clarity. You can't expect Claire and me to wait forever, Edward. We're married. We need to know what we're working with." Edward met his gaze, unblinking. "You'll know when it's time, Ryan," he said, his voice never wavering. "I'll arrange a meeting with Victor. We'll go over everything, but it won't be rushed." Ryan's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he let out a strained laugh. "I see. Well, I guess we'll just have to wait then." Edward didn't acknowledge the comment, turning to walk back toward his study. "I'll have the meeting scheduled." Ryan's posture stiffened, his confidence wavering for the first time. Claire watched him, noting the shift in his demeanor, the crack in the mask. He had overplayed his hand, and now the tension between them felt thicker, more obvious. As Edward disappeared into his study, Claire was left standing in the hallway, her mind swirling with questions she wasn't sure she had the answers to. Ryan's demands, his urgency, it was all too much too quickly, and yet she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest, a feeling that hadn't been there before their return. Ryan turned to her then, his smile back in place, though it no longer felt genuine. "It's all part of the plan, Claire," he said, his voice low. "You'll see. Everything will fall into place soon. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces Ryan wanted to fall into place were not the same ones she had always envisioned. The game had shifted, and she was beginning to realize that things weren't as simple as she'd once thought. The tension in the room was palpable, and Claire felt herself standing on the edge, unsure of which way to step. The tension in the room was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Edward slid the document across the table toward Ryan, the rustling sound of the paper cutting through the stillness. The trust summary, a glimpse into Claire's inheritance, a document Ryan had been waiting for, now lay between them, and the silence that followed seemed almost deliberate. Ryan reached for it with a measured calm, his eyes glinting with a mixture of expectation and entitlement. He hadn't been prepared for the depth of the conditions that lay within the document, but he was determined to find what he had been seeking. The numbers. He scanned the pages quickly, flipping through them with increasing urgency, his eyes darting from line to line. Claire, standing to the side, watched him intently, sensing that something was off, but unsure of what exactly. Ryan's hand paused. His fingers froze on the page. His lips tightened as he scanned a particular section, the words beginning to sink in. Claire could see his eyes narrowing, his confident demeanor faltering for the first time since they'd arrived. He looked up at Edward, confusion flickering in his gaze. "This doesn't make sense," Ryan muttered, his voice slightly unsteady. "Where are the numbers? What's all this?" Edward remained seated, calm and composed as ever. "You're looking for the wrong things, Ryan," he said evenly. "This isn't about numbers. It's about conditions." Ryan's brow furrowed, and he leaned closer to the document, his impatience growing. The words he'd overlooked before now jumped out at him. Conditions tied to Claire's conduct, her actions, and the length of their marriage. His breath caught as he realized the truth. His access to the inheritance wasn't automatic. His marriage to Claire didn't guarantee anything. There were clauses he hadn't counted on, stipulations that would prevent him from taking what he had assumed was his. Ryan had assumed that simply by marrying Claire, he would gain control over her wealth. But now it was clear that wasn't the case. Edward's steady gaze never left Ryan. "The trust isn't a free pass, Ryan. It's a safeguard," he said, his voice measured but carrying the weight of years of planning. "You'll have to meet the terms first. It's never been about entitlement. It's about proving your worth." Ryan's confidence began to crack. His eyes flicked over the pages again, a flicker of disbelief crossing his features. "I'm her husband," he said, his voice hardening, as if trying to convince himself. "I should have access. This is our future. You can't just keep it all locked up." Edward's expression remained unchanged. "It's not up to you to decide that. It's Claire's inheritance, and her choices will dictate whether or not you gain access to it." Ryan's frustration deepened, his fingers tightening on the paper. The mask of confidence he had worn so well, so easily, began to slip, revealing the anger beneath. He looked up at Claire, a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of disbelief and resentment. "So this is how it's going to be, huh? This is what I'm dealing with?" Claire took a step back, startled by the shift in his tone. The charm, the warmth, was gone, replaced by something colder, something more calculated. It was as if Ryan's entire persona had morphed in an instant. For the first time, Claire wasn't sure who she was looking at. This wasn't the man she had married. This was someone entirely different. Someone who saw her inheritance as something owed to him, not something that had to be earned. Ryan's voice wavered, but his words were sharp. "You really think I'm going to just stand by and let him keep everything from me? This is my life too, Claire. I'm entitled to more than this. I deserve more than this." Edward's eyes hardened, his calm still unwavering. "You deserve nothing, Ryan. Not until you've proven you can be trusted." Ryan's jaw clenched, his frustration turning to something darker. "I thought we were building this life together," he said, his voice low, tight with tension. "But clearly, I was wrong." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Ryan stood, unable to meet Edward's gaze any longer, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Claire stood frozen, unsure of what to say, what to do. The man she had married, the one who had promised her everything, had just revealed a side of himself that made her question everything. She glanced at Edward, but his eyes were focused on Ryan, the same controlled expression on his face. Claire wanted to scream, to ask questions, but she couldn't find the words. She was caught between two men, both pulling her in different directions, both controlling the narrative in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. Ryan turned to her, his smile strained, his eyes dark with something Claire couldn't quite name. "I'll figure this out," he said, his voice low. "But don't think this is over, Claire." Claire watched him leave, the door shutting behind him with a quiet finality. She felt the weight of his words, and the room seemed to grow colder. Edward remained still, watching Claire closely, the quiet tension lingering between them. The game had shifted, and Claire was no longer sure where she stood. The room felt suffocating, heavy with unspoken words. Claire had just walked in, hoping for some peace. But Ryan's posture, tense, rigid, immediately set her nerves on edge. She could tell something was different in the air. The calmness of their honeymoon was long gone, replaced by an almost palpable pressure. Ryan's voice cut through the silence, his words sharper than she'd expected. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low but full of accusation. "We need to talk." Claire hesitated, unsure of what to say. She had been thinking about everything, trying to sort out her emotions, but there was no simple answer. "I'm not avoiding you, Ryan," she replied, her voice soft. "I just need some space to think." Ryan's jaw tightened, frustration clearly building inside him. "Space. This is exactly what I mean, Claire. You're letting your father get to you. I thought you were smarter than this. You're letting him control everything." Claire's stomach tightened. She had always known her father was protective, but hearing Ryan frame it this way, this accusation, hurt more than she expected. "I don't know what you mean," Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's just looking out for me," Ryan scoffed, the sound bitter. "Looking out for you? Or keeping you in the dark? Making decisions for you? You can't even make a decision without him interfering. He's been manipulating you this whole time, Claire. You've been so blind to it." The sting of his words hit Claire hard. She hadn't seen it like that before. But now, in Ryan's voice, doubt crept in. Was her father really controlling her? She had always trusted him, but Ryan's words planted a seed of uncertainty she couldn't ignore. Ryan stepped closer, his presence overwhelming now. "You don't have to let him decide everything for you. I'm your husband, Claire. I'm the one who's supposed to help you make decisions. But instead, you're standing by, letting him call all the shots." Claire recoiled, the anger in Ryan's voice cutting deeper than she expected. "I'm not letting anyone decide for me," she said, her voice wavering. "I just don't know what to think anymore." Ryan's eyes hardened. "Then it's time to make a choice. You have to take my side in this. I can't keep fighting this alone, Claire." The words felt like a punch. She was caught between two men, both pulling her in different directions, and both insisting that she choose. She needed time to think, to understand everything that had been said. But Ryan wasn't willing to give her that space. "I need time," she said, trying to stand her ground. "I need space to think about all of this." Ryan's expression twisted, his frustration turning into something darker. "No, you don't get to walk away from this, Claire. Not anymore." His voice, once full of affection, was now hard, demanding. Claire took a step back, her heart racing. She had never seen him like this, and it terrified her. This wasn't the man she had married. This wasn't the future she had imagined. Ryan's gaze pierced hers, his words low and threatening. "You're either with me or against me. I won't wait forever, Claire." Her breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words landed heavily, and she felt something inside her break. She had always known Ryan was ambitious, driven, but now she saw the darker side of that ambition, the side that saw her as a tool to be used, not a partner to be trusted. Edward's calm voice broke the moment, cutting through the tension. "Is everything all right?" Ryan's eyes snapped to Edward, and Claire saw the flash of anger in them. "Everything's fine," Ryan replied coldly, though it was clear that nothing was fine. Edward's eyes moved between them, sensing the friction, but he said nothing more. Claire, however, felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. Ryan's words lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. "I'll be in the other room," he said, his voice tight, his frustration evident. As he left, Claire stood frozen, torn between two worlds, one with her father, one with her husband, and unsure of where her loyalty should lie. Edward didn't move, but his gaze stayed on Claire, waiting for her to speak. She could feel the shift in the room, the crack that had formed between them, and it terrified her. The choice was hers to make, but she didn't know if she was ready. Edward sat alone in his study, the soft hum of his computer the only sound that broke the silence. His mind had been racing all evening, trying to make sense of Ryan's increasingly erratic behavior. Edward had known the man only a few months, but something didn't add up. Ryan's sudden push for Claire's inheritance, his manipulation of her trust. Edward wasn't one to be caught off guard. His instincts told him there was more to the story than just a well-spoken husband. With a steady hand, Edward opened his financial records on the screen, his fingers typing quickly. The man had been living with a certain image, a self-assured, successful businessman. But Edward knew the game Ryan had been playing, and it was time to take a closer look. His years of experience in investment management had taught him how to spot the cracks in someone's financial facade. If Ryan was hiding something, Edward was determined to find it. The first thing he found was debt, piled up across multiple accounts. Ryan had been careful to cover it up, masking it with layers of transactions and a web of companies. But Edward had a trained eye. There it was. Unpaid loans, credit lines maxed out, and interest rates far higher than they should have been. The picture that was emerging wasn't one of financial stability, but desperation. Edward's fingers hovered over the next screen. He'd always known that Ryan was hiding more than just debt. Ryan's investments, which had seemed legitimate on the surface, were nothing more than high-risk ventures. Risky startups, speculative markets, and shadowy partnerships with dubious backers. Ryan had been gambling, trying to recover from his mounting debt with high stakes. It was reckless, dangerous. Edward's stomach turned as he uncovered more troubling patterns. High leverage, businesses teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Shell companies use it to disguise ownership. This wasn't just poor financial management. It was a man in free fall, using his marriage to Claire as a safety net. Edward's suspicions were no longer just suspicions. They were fact. The quiet click of the door opening behind him made Edward look up. Helen, his longtime accountant and confidant, stepped into the room. Her gaze immediately fell on the screen, and she didn't need to ask what she was seeing. "There's a pattern here, Edward," she said quietly, her voice tinged with concern. "The debts, the investments, they're all connected. Ryan's not just in over his head. He's on the brink of collapse." Edward nodded, his thoughts already racing ahead. "This isn't just about money," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "He's trying to leverage Claire's future to cover his own mistakes." Helen's face hardened, and she glanced back at the screen. "He's been manipulating her, hasn't he? Giving her the illusion of security while he gambles everything away." Edward's expression was unreadable as he clicked through another set of documents. "It's not just the money, Helen. There's a deeper motive. Claire's inheritance is his way out. If he can control it, he can fix everything. If not, he'll crash." Helen's eyes met his, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "And if she finds out?" Edward's jaw tightened. "She'll never forgive him?" He picked up the phone, dialing the number for Victor, the family's attorney. As the phone rang, Edward's thoughts moved faster. He had seen enough. He knew Ryan's game, and it was worse than he had feared. The young man's confidence had been nothing but a mask for the desperation beneath. And now, that mask was slipping. Victor answered, and Edward didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Ryan's deeper into this than I thought. There's more going on than just his push for Claire's inheritance. We need to shut it down before it's too late." Victor's voice was steady. "I'll get a meeting scheduled. We'll go over everything." As Edward hung up, the full weight of the situation settled over him. He wasn't just protecting Claire's inheritance anymore. He was protecting her future from a man who would destroy everything to save himself. Ryan's true motive was clear now, and Edward was ready to put a stop to it, no matter what it took. Ryan's voice echoed through the house, more intense than usual. Claire had been in the kitchen, trying to sort through her thoughts, but his words froze her in place. She wasn't trying to listen in, but his conversation was loud enough to pull her in. "Yeah, I'll get my hands on it soon enough," Ryan said, his tone too casual, too confident. "Once the inheritance comes through, we're in the clear. I'll pay off everything, debts, loans, you name it." There was a short pause, followed by a chuckle that sounded forced. "I've been patient, but once it's all mine, we'll finally have everything we deserve." Claire's heart skipped a beat. The words "inheritance" and "mine" hit her like a blow to the chest. Her instinct screamed at her to turn away, but she couldn't move. Her mind raced. Was this what Ryan had been planning all along? She knew they had discussed the trust, but she hadn't realized the extent of his expectations. His assumption that it, her inheritance, was his to claim. His casual tone, as if it were already decided, unsettled her more than she could admit. Ryan continued, oblivious to the fact that Claire was hearing every word. "I've done what I had to do. This whole thing with Claire, marriage, all of it, it was just a step in the plan. Once I get my hands on that money, it'll be smooth sailing. No more pretending, no more hiding." Claire's blood ran cold. The trust, her inheritance, wasn't a solution to his financial troubles. It was a tool for control, a way to fix the mess he had created. Claire took a shaky step back, her chest tightening with a mix of shock and disbelief. Ryan laughed again, but this time it sounded wrong, hollow. "Once it's mine, everything changes. I'll fix all of it. It'll be ours, all of it. No more struggle, just success." Claire stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. The illusion of the perfect life they were supposed to build together was unraveling. She turned and walked quickly to the stairs, her mind spinning, her heart pounding. This wasn't what she had imagined. This wasn't love. It wasn't even partnership. It was manipulation. The following day, Edward sat alone in his study, listening to the recording he had received that morning. It was the conversation between Ryan and an unknown person, a conversation Claire had accidentally overheard. The recording was clear, the words unmistakable. Ryan had made his intentions clear. The trust, the inheritance. It wasn't about Claire's future. It was about Ryan's survival. Edward leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable, as he processed what he had just heard. Ryan's smooth confidence, his plan to secure Claire's wealth to solve his own financial chaos. It all lined up now. The debts, the risky ventures, the need for a quick fix. Ryan wasn't just marrying Claire for love. He was marrying her for a way out. As the minutes ticked by, Edward's expression grew colder. He'd suspected something was off, but hearing Ryan speak so plainly about the inheritance, with no care for the consequences, confirmed it. This wasn't just a financial issue. It was an emotional betrayal, too. Claire stood in the doorway, looking at Edward, her eyes full of pain and confusion. She hadn't meant to overhear the conversation, but she couldn't ignore what she had learned. The trust, the inheritance. It was all part of Ryan's plan to secure himself. To Claire, it felt like a slap in the face. Everything she had trusted, everything she had built with Ryan, now seemed like a lie. Edward stood up, his calm demeanor never wavering. "I knew something wasn't right," he said quietly. "Ryan isn't what he seems." Claire's voice trembled as she spoke. "I don't know who he is anymore. The man I married isn't the one I thought he was." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes full of concern. "It's not too late, Claire, but you need to decide what comes next." Claire nodded slowly, her heart aching. She had to face the truth. She wasn't just caught between two men. She was caught in a game much bigger than herself. Ryan had shown his true face, and now Claire had to decide where her future lay. The house was unnervingly quiet as Edward stepped into the study. The heavy wood door creaked shut behind him, and for a moment the sound of it seemed to echo through the stillness. Ryan was sitting at the desk, his back turned, reviewing some documents. When Edward entered, Ryan didn't immediately look up. There was something about his posture, tense, rigid, that told Edward everything he needed to know. Ryan knew why he was here, and he wasn't ready to face it. Edward didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Ryan glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he met Edward's gaze. There was a flicker of irritation in his expression, but he masked it quickly, regaining his usual confident facade. "About what?" he asked, his tone casual, but Edward could hear the edge in it. "About Claire," Edward replied, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving Ryan's. "And about the trust." Ryan's lips curled into a thin, forced smile. "I thought we'd already settled all that. What's this about now?" Edward pulled out a set of papers from his briefcase, sliding them across the desk. Ryan's eyes flicked to the documents, his fingers pausing before he reached for them. "What's this?" Ryan asked, though it was clear he already knew. "This," Edward said, his voice steady, "is evidence of your actions, the lies, the manipulation, the debts you've been hiding, the ventures you've been gambling with. It's all here." Edward paused, his gaze sharp. You've been using Claire's trust as a way to fix your financial problems, Ryan. And that stops now. Ryan's face tightened, the smile vanishing as anger crept into his features. He leaned back in his chair, his posture defensive, as if the walls were closing in on him. "You don't know what you're talking about," Ryan shot back, his voice rising. "I've done what I had to do. This is about us, about securing our future, not just hers. You think I'm trying to steal from her? You've got it all wrong." "I don't think you're trying to steal from her," Edward replied evenly, his eyes piercing through Ryan's excuses. "I think you've been using her for your own gain, pretending everything was fine while secretly digging yourself deeper. This isn't about us. This is about you, your desperation. And now you've crossed a line." Ryan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm not listening to this." His voice was sharp, full of defiance. "I'm not some pawn for you to manipulate. You think I care about your accusations? I'll take you to court, Edward. You want to play this game? Let's see how it turns out for you." Edward didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, almost detached. "If you want to go to court, Ryan, I'm ready, but you'll lose, because I have the truth. And the truth is something you can't deny, no matter how many lawyers you throw at it." Ryan took a step forward, his fist clenching, his face flushed with anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with. This is my wife's future, and I'll fight for it. I'm not backing down." His voice dropped, dripping with venom. "I'll make sure you regret this." Edward's eyes remained steady, unwavering. "You've already made that choice," he said quietly, the weight of the words hanging in the air. "But you're wrong about one thing. You're not fighting for Claire. You're fighting for yourself." Ryan's expression faltered for a moment, the mask slipping, but he quickly recovered, pushing past Edward toward the door. "This isn't over," he muttered, his tone dark with threat. Not by a long shot. Edward stayed rooted to the spot, his jaw tight, his mind working through the implications of Ryan's reaction. Anger, threats. None of it had surprised him, but the sheer arrogance, the refusal to admit fault, those were things he couldn't ignore. From the hallway, Claire had been listening, her body pressed against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest. The door had been slightly ajar, and she had heard everything. The truth about Ryan, his manipulation, his threats. She didn't move as Ryan stormed past her, his eyes flashing with fury. Claire didn't know what to say, what to feel. Part of her wanted to confront him, but another part of her was numb, her heart heavy with betrayal. Ryan didn't even glance at her as he passed. His anger was still burning bright, the door slamming behind him as he left. Claire stood motionless, her hands trembling. Edward's calm had been the only thing grounding her. But now, as the silence settled between them, she knew one thing for sure. Things would never be the same again. Edward glanced at her, his eyes softening for just a moment before he spoke. "You're safe, Claire," he said quietly, but the weight of it lingered. "You don't have to worry about him anymore." But Claire wasn't sure if she felt safe, or if she even knew who to trust anymore. The tension in the air was thick, and Claire didn't know how to step forward. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing. Ryan had already shown his true colors, and now the game was forever changed. Edward sat across from Claire, the documents laid out before him. His hand hovered over the paper, the weight of the decision settling heavily in his chest. For months, he'd watched as Ryan's behavior grew more erratic, more entitled. The trust, their safety, was always meant to protect Claire from people like Ryan. And now, the clause he'd inserted years ago, the one that had remained dormant all this time, was about to activate. Claire looked up, her expression weary. "What does it mean, Edward? What happens now?" Edward met her eyes, the calm in his voice belying the gravity of the situation. "Ryan has triggered a clause in the trust. He's disqualified himself from any access to it. Permanently." Claire's breath hitched. "He what?" Edward nodded, the words confirming a truth that had been gnawing at him for weeks. The clause in the trust was put in place for exactly this reason. If someone, especially a spouse, manipulated or attempted to take advantage of the inheritance, they would be blocked. Ryan's actions, his push for control over everything, have triggered it. Claire sat back, the realization sinking in. The man she had married, the man she thought she could trust, had pushed her into a corner she wasn't prepared for. The inheritance, her future, had become his game to win. But now it was no longer his to claim. Edward continued, his voice steady but firm. "Everything he's done, everything he's said, it's documented. The evidence is clear. The trust is airtight. He has no claim anymore." Claire's mind was spinning. She had suspected something was off, but to hear it so plainly laid out, Ryan had triggered his own undoing. "I can't believe it," she whispered, her hands shaking as she reached for the papers in front of her. "I married him thinking he loved me, and now I realize it was all just for this?" Edward's eyes softened, his protective instincts flaring. "You didn't know, Claire. None of this was your fault." The door creaked open, and Ryan stepped into the room, his expression tense, as if he already knew what was coming. His eyes flicked to the papers, then to Claire, and back to Edward. "What's all this?" Ryan's voice was tight, the mask of charm slipping. "You've been keeping something from me, haven't you, Edward?" Edward's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "We need to talk, Ryan, about your actions and about the trust. You've made some choices that can't be undone." Ryan's jaw clenched. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've done nothing wrong." He turned to Claire, his voice softening, but the insincerity was clear. "Claire, you know I've always had your best interests at heart. We've been building this life together." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. "You've been building it with me, Ryan, but not for me. This whole time, you've been planning for your future, not ours." Ryan's face hardened, the calm mask replaced by something darker. "You've got it all wrong," he snapped, his anger rising. "This is for us, all of it. But you don't see that, do you?" Edward stood, his presence imposing. "You've crossed a line, Ryan, and now you'll face the consequences." Ryan's eyes narrowed, his voice growing colder. "You think you've won? You can't control me. I'll take this to court. I'll fight for what's mine." Edward's face remained unchanged, his voice calm but firm. "You're welcome to try, but you'll lose. The clause is clear, Ryan. You've disqualified yourself. The trust is closed to you, permanently." Ryan's expression flickered, anger, disbelief, and then a sharp realization. The truth hit him too late. His manipulation, his demands, had all led to this irreversible outcome. His future, his claim to Claire's wealth, had crumbled before him. Ryan took a step back, his face red with fury, but he said nothing more. He turned and stormed out of the room, his anger echoing in the silence he left behind. Claire stood there, her body tense, her mind racing. She had always known something wasn't right, but now she had the truth. Ryan had been using her, and now it was over. Edward placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle but resolute. "It's done, Claire. You're safe." But as Claire looked at the door Ryan had just left through, she knew things had changed. The battle wasn't over, but the war had shifted, and she was no longer a pawn in Ryan's game. The control had shifted irreversibly, and the weight of it hung between them. The days after the confrontation felt like a slow unraveling of everything Claire had once believed in. The life she had built with Ryan, her partner, her confidant, was slipping through her fingers. His true nature had come to light, and with it, the consequences she hadn't expected. It started quietly at first, with Ryan's calls growing more frequent, his voice tight with anger. He blamed everyone but himself, trying to turn the tables and paint himself as the victim. But soon the whispers became louder. Rumors spread like wildfire. Ryan wasn't just upset, he was furious. And when he couldn't control the situation with charm or manipulation, he took it public. Claire had seen it all before, his ego bruised, but now it felt different. This time the mask slipped entirely. Ryan gave an interview to the press, a calculated move to sway public opinion. His charm was gone, replaced by a harsh, bitter edge. He accused Claire of betrayal, claimed that he had been misled by her father, by Edward, and that he had been duped into believing the trust was his for the taking. His words were sharp, a public lash against Claire, an attempt to smear her name. "I did what I had to do," Ryan said in the interview, his voice cold. "I was looking out for my future. What would you do if you were me? My only crime was loving her." Claire watched the footage with numb disbelief. The lies, twisted, deliberate, rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. He painted himself as a man wronged, a husband who had only wanted to build a future, and now he was the one left with nothing. The worst part was how convincing he was. His words struck a chord with some. But Claire saw the truth in every word, heard the desperation beneath the bravado. Then came the creditors. It had always been a matter of time, but once Ryan's financial lies began to unravel, the dam burst wide open. Collections agencies, lenders, and unpaid debts suddenly surfaced from the shadows. Ryan's reckless spending and risky ventures, everything he had tried to hide, was now exposed. He was drowning, scrambling to salvage what was left of his reputation. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and it was coming for him in waves. Edward stayed silent through it all. There were no public statements, no gestures to intervene. He had prepared for this, and now he let the pieces fall as they would. Ryan's public outburst, his lies, and the exposure of his debts all fed into the inevitable collapse of his facade. Edward wasn't going to fight Ryan's battle for him. This was Ryan's mess to clean up. But Claire? Claire felt every bit of it. The marriage she thought was built on trust was now being torn apart in front of her, and she felt like a spectator in her own life. The fury she had once felt for Ryan was now replaced by a deep, hollow grief. She had loved him, believed in him, and now every word, every action felt like a betrayal. She had been so blind. She withdrew emotionally, retreating into herself. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and the distance between her and Ryan grew with each passing day. Their once shared moments now felt like memories of someone else's life. The love they had was suffocated under the reality of his manipulation, and Claire couldn't bring herself to reach out, to try and salvage what was left. Ryan, desperate to keep control, tried to reach her. Long, heated arguments, followed by empty apologies, followed by more lies. But Claire couldn't find the energy to care anymore. The person she had loved, the man she had married, had disappeared long ago. And in his place was someone unrecognizable. The tension in the house became unbearable, a strain on everything they once shared. Every word between them felt like a battle, and the more Ryan fought to regain control, The more Claire realized it wasn't just their marriage that was breaking. It was their future, everything they had planned. The consequences of his actions weren't just financial. They were personal, emotional, and they were accelerating. Claire stood at the crossroads of a life she couldn't return to, with no idea where the path would lead. Her trust had been shattered, and the future she had once envisioned was slipping out of her grasp. Ryan's world was crumbling, but so was hers. The consequences were clear, but the hardest part was still to come. Would she find a way to heal, or would she walk away, leaving everything behind? The question loomed, unanswered, as the fallout continued to unfold. Claire stood before Ryan, the silence between them sharp as broken glass. She had spent months questioning the little things, the late nights, the excuses, the growing distance. But now, everything came crashing down. The truth had to come out. She couldn't carry this weight any longer. "Ryan," she began, her voice steady but strained. "I need you to be honest with me. What's going on? What are you hiding?" Her words hit the air like a challenge. She wasn't asking anymore. She was demanding. Ryan shifted uncomfortably on the couch, his eyes flicking away from hers. It was enough. Claire could see it in his face. The guilt, the avoidance. It wasn't the truth, not even close. "Claire, this isn't—" He stopped himself, exhaling in frustration, as though he could talk his way out of it. "You're overreacting, that's all." Her heart thundered, the anger rising quickly, a force she hadn't expected to feel so intensely. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice rising. "I've seen the texts, the late hours, the way you've been pulling away. What are you not telling me?" Ryan looked away again, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to admit it. Claire could see it in the way he was trying to bury the truth beneath his usual deflections. It stung deep. "Don't you dare brush me off like this," she continued, the words spilling out. "I deserve more than that. I deserve the truth." For a long moment, Ryan said nothing. He just sat there, his lips pressed together in that familiar way that told her he was holding something back. Claire's frustration turned to disbelief. How long had she been living with this? How long had she been afraid to ask? Before the silence could swallow them whole, the doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected. Claire's stomach twisted as she glanced toward the door. Ryan didn't move. The tension between them was unbearable now, suffocating. Claire opened the door, and there stood Edward. His eyes were kind, but there was a quiet understanding in them, an unspoken recognition of the storm swirling inside the apartment. "Are you okay?" Edward asked, his voice gentle, his concern clear. Claire didn't answer at first. She glanced back at Ryan, but he didn't meet her gaze. She knew then this wasn't going anywhere. She was done waiting for honesty that would never come. Edward stepped inside, his presence calm but strong. He didn't offer advice, didn't try to fix anything. He was simply there, offering support in a way Ryan couldn't. Claire felt the first thread of relief, but it was fleeting. She turned back to the table, pulled out the papers, and without hesitation signed them. The decision was made. She was done. Ryan could say nothing more to change her mind. With the papers signed, she felt something shift inside her, something light, something free. She didn't look back at Ryan as she walked toward the door. The door slammed behind her, and for the first time in a long time, Claire felt the weight lift. The papers were filed. The waiting was over. And with that, freedom began. Claire stared at the papers in front of her, feeling the weight of each word, each clause. Edward had come through, as he always did, methodical, precise, unwavering. He had restructured her assets, everything from the savings to the investments. ensuring that she would be independent, untethered from the suffocating hold Ryan had once held over her life. The shift felt monumental, like the first deep breath after years of holding it in. "This is what you wanted," Edward said, his voice low but certain. There was no pity in his tone, no softening of the truth. He was a quiet force, the kind of person who understood that independence wasn't just about finances. It was about the space to breathe, to reclaim control. Claire nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She felt a strange combination of relief and grief. Her financial independence wasn't just a practical change. It was the final piece of a puzzle she'd been working on for months. The emotional ties were still there, the lingering pull of what she'd lost, but the foundation beneath her was now solid. Ryan was fading from relevance. Slowly, quietly, he was becoming nothing more than a name. She didn't have to fight to erase him from her mind, didn't have to make grand gestures or speeches. The freedom she was carving out was deliberate, quiet, and far more powerful than any public declaration of victory could ever be. And yet, in the stillness of her apartment, something inside Claire shifted. She wasn't whole. Not yet. Not with all the pieces scattered in the wake of the past few months. She needed more than just financial freedom. She needed her mind to catch up. She made the call the next day. Therapy. The word had felt foreign to her at first, an impossible thing to ask for. But the more she sat with her emotions, the more she realized that her healing needed to come from more than just actions. It needed to come from within. The first session was strange, unfamiliar. She spoke in fragments at first, unsure of how to give voice to everything she was feeling. Anger, betrayal, grief. They poured out of her in waves she hadn't expected, but there was something cathartic in it. The therapist didn't rush her, didn't try to fix it all at once. Instead, there was simply a presence, a calm acceptance that allowed Claire to start untangling the mess in her mind. As the weeks passed, she began to rebuild. Slowly, bit by bit, her confidence returned. It wasn't like flipping a switch. It wasn't dramatic. But with each session, with each new understanding of herself, Claire started to feel whole again, strong again. Ryan, as much as she had once wanted closure, began to fade into the background. His absence felt less like a gaping wound and more like a scar that, though still there, no longer controlled her every thought. There were no public scenes, no accusations hurled in anger, nothing for anyone to see. It wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a quiet, dignified retreat, and Claire was learning to accept it. As she sat in her apartment one evening, watching the sun set over the skyline, Claire felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. It wasn't perfection, not yet, but it was her peace. And that was enough. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to breathe. The quiet safety she had fought for was finally settling around her. But there was still a shadow, still something lingering in the edges of her new life. And Claire wasn't sure if she was ready to face it yet. Claire sat across from her father, the silence between them comfortable, but charged with unspoken understanding. The weight of their shared history hung in the air, yet there was a quiet calm now. She had come to him not just for support, but for something deeper, something that only a parent could offer in moments like these. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with gratitude. It wasn't a casual thank you. This wasn't a simple acknowledgement of a favor or a gesture. It was deeper. She had come to realize that her father's unwavering support, his methodical approach to everything, had been more than just a safety net. It had been a lifeline, Her father, Edward, met her gaze, his expression calm, unreadable. There was no pride in his eyes, no triumph in his voice. "You don't need to thank me, Claire," he said softly, his words steady and sure. "I just did what was necessary, what needed to be done." There was no "I told you so," no smugness, no passive-aggressive remark about how he'd warned her, how he'd known from the start. Edward had never been that way. His love wasn't conditional, and neither were his actions. He wasn't here to say, "I told you so." He was here to prepare her, to guide her with a quiet, loving strength that she had often taken for granted in the past. But now she understood. She had spent so long feeling angry with him, resentful even, because of his calculated detachment, the way he had kept his distance while she struggled with Ryan. She had hated him for not stepping in sooner, for not taking control of her life the way he was capable of. But now, with everything falling into place, she realized the truth. He had done exactly what was needed. He had stood back, respected her autonomy, and simply made sure she had the tools to make her own decisions. It wasn't control, it was preparation. Claire could feel the weight of the past few months beginning to lift off her shoulders. The grief, the anger, the years of tension, it was all there. But now there was something else. Trust. A deeper understanding of the kind of love her father had given her. Not the suffocating kind, not the overbearing kind, but the kind that allowed her to stand on her own feet. He had never needed to fix things for her. He had just needed to equip her to fix them herself. "Why didn't you intervene earlier?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more reflective than accusatory. She had to know. Edward exhaled slowly, his gaze softening as he spoke. "Because you needed to learn to trust yourself, Claire. You needed to see what was really happening, to make your own choices. I couldn't do that for you." She absorbed his words, feeling a ripple of something between them. Respect, not just from her side, but from his. She had never fully understood the balance he had always maintained between his deep love for her and his respect for her independence. Now she did. The resentment she had held toward him for so long began to slip away, replaced by a deep, steady respect. There was no grand gesture of reconciliation, no sudden revelation, just the quiet settling of two people finding peace with where they were, together. Claire felt something shift inside her, a sense of healing, a sense of closure. I'm glad you were here," she said finally, her voice tinged with the weight of all that had happened, yet somehow lighter. "I'm starting to see it now, how much you were looking out for me, even when I didn't see it." Edward nodded, his face a study of calm love. "You're stronger than you know, Claire. Always have been." For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire allowed herself to relax. Just a little. There was no grand finale, no dramatic change. But something within her was settling, slowly, piece by piece. And though the road ahead would be long for the first time in a long while, Claire felt a sense of peace settle within her. But as she looked up at her father, a thought lingered, unspoken. What else was left unsaid between them? There was still a gap, a quiet tension that neither had fully addressed. Claire wasn't sure what it meant yet, but she knew. She wasn't finished learning from him, not yet. Edward leaned back in his chair, the quiet hum of the evening settling around him. The room was dimly lit, the shadows casting long, muted lines across the walls. It was a moment of stillness, the calm after a storm that had seemed endless. Yet his thoughts were far from peaceful. They had never truly been. He thought back to that day, the wedding day, the day Claire had walked down the aisle, her face a mix of joy and uncertainty, trusting that everything would fall into place. In that moment, Edward had been proud of her, but also deeply anxious. He hadn't shared that with her. He hadn't shared much at all, not the way he had feared for her, nor how much he had held back in the background. He had let her step into her marriage with Ryan, knowing full well the kind of man he was, but trusting that Claire would see the truth in time. But when he saw Ryan that day, standing at the altar, so confident and polished, Edward knew that the warning signs he had kept hidden, buried beneath layers of patience and calculated restraint, were never enough. He had wanted to intervene, wanted to protect her from the very beginning. But there had been something in him, something that believed still that Claire needed to make her own choices, to feel the full weight of her decisions. What he had withheld from her, what he had kept back, was not just the knowledge of the inheritance. It was the entire picture of who Ryan really was. Edward had suspected even then the kind of man Ryan could be. He had seen glimpses of the manipulation, the lies, the subtle shifts in behavior that only someone experienced in reading people could recognize. But he hadn't told Claire. Not directly, anyway. "I thought I could trust him," Claire had said once, her voice thick with hurt, after everything had fallen apart. Edward remembered the pain in her eyes, the same hurt he saw reflected in her now, in the slow rebuilding of herself. He had never wanted her to feel that. He had only wanted her to feel safe. But to do that, he knew he had to step back. She needed to see Ryan's true nature with her own eyes, not through the lens of her father's warnings. Ryan, in the end, had exposed himself faster than anyone had expected. The cracks that Edward had seen long ago splintered open in a way that was both brutal and swift. Edward hadn't needed to take action, to interfere. It had all unraveled with alarming clarity, and the pieces fell into place without him having to lift a finger. Ryan's own choices, his own arrogance, had led him to betray Claire in ways that no amount of hiding could protect. There had been no need for revenge, not on Edward's part. What had been needed was structure, careful patience, and a belief that in time the truth would emerge. His daughter didn't need him to destroy Ryan's life. She needed him to protect hers. The inheritance, what Ryan had so desperately believed he was entitled to, had never been hidden from Claire. Not really. It had only ever been kept from the man who didn't deserve it. It was never about money. It was about understanding. Edward had known that the true inheritance, the legacy, wasn't in the material wealth he had kept safe. It was in Claire's strength, her ability to rebuild herself, and to see through the smoke and mirrors Ryan had created. Now, as Edward thought back on it all, he knew that it hadn't been about his power or control. It had been about trusting Claire to learn, to grow, and to realize, on her own, the depth of the betrayal she had suffered. But as he sat there, the quiet uncertainty gnawed at him. Had he made the right choice? Had he protected her enough? Or had he kept too much from her for too long? The weight of those unanswered questions lingered, unresolved, as the night stretched on. And in the back of his mind, a single thought remained. What would Claire do next?